Well, this is the second hour of News, Debate and Opinion here on All Out Politics. Back Brexit or face chaos, that is the warning from David Davis to MPs who'll vote on the government's EU withdrawal bill this evening. The government is whipping its MPs hard to make sure the bill passes, as Labour and Liberal Democrats say they'll oppose the legislation because it amounts to a power grab, a claim the Brexit Minister, Robin Walker, denies.
The reality is, to vote down this bill, to say we don't need any legislation of this sort, is either to try and frustrate the process of Brexit itself, or, even worse, to recognise that Brexit is going to go ahead, but to try and make sure it goes ahead in the most chaotic way possible.
We are very, very suspicious of the government's motivations here, because you don't need the ability to change primary legislation by decree for a minister in order to have a smooth and orderly Brexit. So why do they want these powers? Well, joining me now are the Labour MP and, of course, previous Remain supporter Stephen Kinnock and the Leave supporter and Conservative MP Bernard Jenkin. Welcome to you both. Stephen Kinnock, are you going to vote for chaos tonight?
It's nothing to do with chaos, it's to do with parliamentary sovereignty. I mean, whatever the Brexit vote was about, it surely wasn't about degrading our constitutional values, degrading the role of Parliament. I thought it was about taking back control and building the sovereignty and power of the mother of all democracies. And this bill actually is a silent coup d'etat. It's about the executive making a massive power grab, undermining the role of Parliament and shifting to rule by decree. And in my view, that is not delivering the will of the people.
Well, you always expect from oppositions a certain amount of professional outrage, and we're getting that, and from people who are very disappointed we're leaving the European Union. And this is to be expected. And there's a perfectly legitimate debate about scrutiny. But this is about scrutiny, not sovereignty. The constitutional outrage was the way the European Union made laws without anything touching the ground in this kingdom, let alone in Parliament.
Yeah, but you want to make it better.
Yes, of course. From your
perspective.
This is much better because
and the problem is that the argument is that the way in which the government is doing this is not giving Parliament back any power. It's the executive taking it all.
Well, it's not. It is giving Parliament back power because every single legal instrument will be blockable by Parliament. So they're not decrees that came down from Europe. Every single one. The question is how we scrutinise them. And I think there's a perfectly legitimate debate, Stephen, that we talk about how we improve the scrutiny of statutory instruments generally, particularly these instruments we call Henry VIII clauses that amend primary statute. But your government put through constitutional legislation with Henry VIII clauses in them, like the devolution statutes that stay on the statute book today. The government has the power to amend primary statute by a secondary instrument. So let's have this discussion about how to make this perhaps more tasteful, but it isn't the constitutional outrage you pretend it to be.
I just don't think that historical analogy holds, because what we're talking about here is unravelling 40 years of
we're not unravelling anything. We're keeping it the same.
But, I mean,
and so if you grant powers to ministers to simply decide whether or not it's appropriate to use a Henry VIII power, then you've got to have that built into the bill that we can't do that. So we're saying we don't have a problem with the bill in principle, but as things stand, it's not fit for purpose.
It in principle. That's Jeremy Corbyn's position.
Because the government has refused to deal with us on any of the amendments that we're proposing.
But in principle, you accept A, that Britain is leaving the European Union, and B, that if we do so as a legislator, we need to incorporate this law into British law.
Yes, absolutely. But as a legislator, I want to be able to go to Parliament and exercise the powers that the people of my constituency vested in me to scrutinise the executive. And this bill will neuter Parliament, and it will turn us from legislators into commentators.
But defeating it tonight would actually be a way of delaying the whole process, wouldn't it, of perhaps trying to stay in the EU?
No, because I think what we're saying is we'd have a reasoned amendment which says we can't support the bill in its present form, accept our reasoned amendment, open up to the amendments that we need to see, and then of course the bill goes through. But it needs presumed competence for the devolved administrations. It needs institutional parity, where we don't have British institutions that can do what EU institutions currently do. We need an impact clause to make sure that we protect our rights, and we need also proper scrutiny. I would recommend people look at the Hansard Society's report on a sift and scrutiny committee that makes sure that we get this right because it's about our democracy.
And I get the impression you are quite sympathetic to a lot of that.
Yeah, I think the Hansard Society report is very good, but of course the Hansard Society report isn't about amending the bill at all. It's about reforming our procedures in the House of Commons and in the House of Lords. And to that extent, I think there's a dialogue. Look, Stephen,
but, do you think the government's made a mess of it, though? I mean,
no, I think the opposition's making a mess of it because I think the government is up for a conversation about this if people are acting in good faith. But if the Labour opposition are voting against the principle of the bill, because that's what second reading debate is about, I think it's difficult for us to engage in a conversation about this when we can't have confidence that they actually support the principle of the process.
But we have a reasoned amendment which sets out our reservations about the bill.
If
those reservations were taken on board by the government in this so-called spirit of democratic
engagement... Okay, let me ask you a question. If the reasoned amendment is defeated, will you then vote for the second reading of the bill?
No, because the reasoned amendment sets out clearly what we need to see in the bill to make it fit for purpose. I can't vote for a bill that's not fit for purpose.
But there is
it's about democratic control.
There is a division amongst Labour pro-Europeans because, for example, Caroline Flint, the former Europe Minister, says that in the end she will vote for the second reading because you have to accept the principle behind it.
Well, I mean, there's a difference of opinion there because my view is, and I think the view of the vast majority of the Parliamentary Labour Party, that we accept the need to transpose EU legislation onto the British statute book. That's not in question. What is in question is the bill, as it currently stands, isn't doing that. It's actually a power grab. It is neutering Parliament, giving far too much power to the executive, and in my view that's not delivering on the will of the British people. The people that voted to leave the European Union in the referendum voted to enhance the sovereignty and power and strength of the British Parliament, and this bill will do none of those things.
Well, I'm so glad you're in favour of that now, because you weren't before.
I've always been in favour of it. I've always been in favour of it. In my view, membership of the European Union actually enhances that.
I gave you a free one. But probably you've got people like Tony Blair saying, paradoxically, he says, we've got to accept the referendum result in order to be able to change it. That's what he said. I mean, you know, that is an absolute classic of Tony Blair, saying both things out of both sides of his mouth at the same time, which are completely...
But presumably saying things about...
It means he doesn't accept it.
No, but saying things about limiting immigration, which you presumably welcome.
Yes, but the point is, if you accept the referendum result, that doesn't mean you're trying to change it, and he is trying to change it. And, you know, if the Labour Party wants to engage in good faith with the government on this, stop sending all these signals that actually you don't accept the referendum result.
What did you make of Tony Blair's intervention?
Tony can speak for himself. I voted to trigger Article 5. I campaigned passionately for Remain, and you know I make no secret of that, and I'm proud of the fact that I did so. But I absolutely accept the referendum result. I voted to trigger Article 50. This is not about whether we leave the European Union, it's how we leave it. And we have to do it. What a terrible irony it would be if people voted to enhance the strength of our Parliament and the sovereignty of our Parliament, and then through Brexit we get the opposite result.
No, that's not going to happen.
I mean, this could end up being the biggest own goal the Conservatives have ever scored, because as we all know, you're not terribly popular in the opinion polls at the moment, and you'd be handing all these Henry VIII powers to King Corbyn I.
Well, actually, all these Henry VIII powers are temporary, and I hear what you're saying. There isn't going to be an early general election. I think the vote tonight will demonstrate that actually Theresa's authority is more extensive than people think.
But I mean, the majority is pretty flimsy, isn't it? And the latest analysis, for example, says that even the deal with the DUP may face a parliamentary vote. Now, is that going to get through?
When you say it may face a parliamentary vote, the DUP will support the government on any issue of confidence. I don't understand.
They've had their £1 billion to make sure that happens.
Well, when we leave the EU, there's going to be lots of money for everybody because we won't be making our net,
the 350 million for the NHS as well. Yeah.
But I mean, the £1 billion deal or the £10 billion deal. I mean, there's going to be a vote on that apparently.
I suspect the DUP will vote for that. But I mean, the DUP have got actually quite a legitimate case to make for the long reconstruction necessary in Northern Ireland, the transition through the Brexit process, and other parts of the
magic money tree.
Other parts of the United Kingdom also deserve extra funding. They get extra funding. Wales is a bit short-changed, but hopefully we will be able to deal with these.
This is where it all gets so complicated because
it's not very complicated.
Well, you know what's happened in the courts today, and this is breaking news, is a ruling that the it actually contravenes the payment to the DUP, contravenes the Bribery Act and the Good Friday Act, Friday Agreement.
I haven't seen that, and I don't know anything about it. So you caught me
well,
blindsided.
I wasn't, but that's big. If that is the case, then I think Theresa May has got serious questions.
But this is, I mean, if you take that example, it in a sense shows that perhaps you shouldn't get quite so agitated about this, because there are the courts, there are procedures away from the chamber which could actually hold back a government from being able to act as Henry VIII did.
I can't imagine anything less, anything more important than this simple fact, which is the laws that govern our country are made by Parliament, not by the executive.
Exactly.
And this bill actually hands a massive amount of power, subjective, random decisions can be made, and that leads to bad legislation and bad decision-making.
It's all quite technical. I mean, can you give an example of something you think might happen if this bill goes through unamended?
So, on institutional parity, let's take, for example, aviation. As things stand, the regulation of aviation across the European Union is Europeanised. There is a European agency, and you have to, any member state has to demonstrate that its aviation rules and regulations comply with that agency. What will happen when we come out of that agency, when we leave the European Union? We don't have a British agency to replace that capability. So let's just be absolutely clear that we need institutional parity. Where there isn't a British agency that can fulfil the role that's currently fulfilled by a European agency, we're going to have a huge governance gap unless we have a clause in this bill which ensures that we don't legislate on that basis until we have institutional parity. That's just one example.
Okay.
But actually, this is not a very complicated problem. The Civil Aviation Authority still exists. It used to govern aviation safety in the United Kingdom. The European Aviation Safety Agency is quite a new institution. Going back to what we had is not complicated. And there is an example. We can debate how that legislation should be dealt with, but the legislation to transfer those powers back to the Civil Aviation Authority and restore what it used to be should be quite simple.
But we do have